All right. So I said, I'm a taphophile. Let me explain to you what a taphophile is. A taphophile is one who loves cemeteries. Loves to be in cemeteries, loves to walk through cemeteries, just loves being in cemeteries, looking at stones, looking at the symbolism on stones, deciphering that symbolism, finding out what it means. And we are so fortunate here in Massillon. We have one of the best cemeteries around. And walking through the Massillon Cemetery is like counting tree rings or taking a core sample. You can walk through the cemetery starting at the house, at the main office, and as you walk into the cemetery, you can actually see the different decades of Massillon by the way the stones change shape and texture and color and material that they were made out of. Fabulous cemetery. I became a taphophile, a lover of cemeteries, when my grandmother took me to the cemetery when I was 5 years old to decorate the family plot. And fell in love immediately with the cemetery. She scared the crap out of me. She told me to look into the Kern Mausoleum, and I had Mr. Kern staring me right back. So, but I fell in love with the cemetery. She let me wander around that day. I walked out on top of the roof of the really large mausoleum down below. Margie, which one is that?
I can't think which one you can walk on.
Warwick has.
Well,
What's the big mausoleum? Warwick that has
Yes.
100 steps leading up to it?
Oh, no, that's the Snyder.
Snipe, okay. Well, from my family's plot, you could walk out onto the roof of that and see the whole lower portion of the cemetery. I didn't tell my mom that I did that until I was about 20 years old. But my grandmother, when I was 5, let me do that. She let me walk out on top of there and look around. My taphophilia really kicked into high gear when, at the age of 7, we moved into a house that was built in 1868, and it was built on top of a significant chunk of what is Kendal Cemetery. So I grew up in a house that was built on top of Kendal Cemetery. And a couple of quick stories about that. I'll be talking about Mrs. Nell Tipping in a little bit, but I remember clearly, vividly, Mrs. Nell Tipping lived next to Kendal Cemetery for 60 years. And she kept this wonderful handwritten journal. And I remember her standing next to my mother in our front yard. And I remember her saying, "There's a little girl buried right there." That was my first recollection of actually being buried on a cemetery, or living on a cemetery. And then later on, my friend Dwayne, who lived on the corner down the street, invited me into his house, and the back of his fireplace, the back of the family's fireplace, was a headstone. And whoever built the house didn't even have the good sense to turn the inscription inward. You could still see the inscription on the firestone. But here's the best story. I was about 8 years old, and our neighbor, our next door neighbor, Mr. Henry Gresser, was digging down to shore up the porch, his porch. The front corner of his porch had started to sink. And he started digging down. He was going to shore that end of his porch up, and he hit remains. And he shoveled the dirt back in. And that porch is still not level today. And what's interesting, years later, I found this is the days of Google Maps. I found this map, and I'll put it up here if you want to look at it after my talk. I found this map. This is of my neighborhood growing up. This is my mom's house. This is Mr. Gresser's house, or this is Mr. Gresser's house. And where the boundaries of Kendal Cemetery intersect, they are exactly on the corner of his front porch. So that kind of corroborated for me that, wow, that really did happen. I really saw this guy dig up some human remains. So I'll set this up. Okay, well anyway, there is not a lot of information available. Let me read you one thing. I wanted to dazzle everyone with my, speaking extemporaneously and using very few note cards, but even though I wrote this, I wasn't able to memorize it, so I'm just going to read this to you. Because there is a distinction that I think is important. A cemetery or graveyard is a place where the dead are interred. Cemetery implies land that is specifically designated as a burial ground. Although cemetery and graveyard are often used interchangeably, a A graveyard is a burial ground associated with a church, often located on church property. So where Charity Roach is buried, that is a graveyard. Kendal burying ground is a cemetery, so there is a difference. So in the years, in the years that Kendal Cemetery was operating, from 1811 until 1848, not a lot of information that I've been able to find. Very little. So what I did in trying, I thought what I would try and do, since there was not a lot of information about the cemetery itself, I got interested in who may be buried there. I wanted to find out if I could find some names, some dates, maybe some names that I recognized, names that were still here in town. So I went down to the cemetery office, and there's a wonderful woman that works there. Her name is Rose Buxton. She's a part-time employee, and she works 10 until 1, 5 days a week. She was gracious enough to allow me access to the handwritten cemetery records starting in 1820 or so, up through about the 1920s, all handwritten records. So every Thursday for a year, from 10 until 1, Thursday was my day off, I was down at that office and I went through those records page by page by page, writing down names, dates of death, causes of death, and put all this stuff onto a spreadsheet. Not a lot of information other than the names. Causes of death is very interesting. One lady froze to death. Not unusual to find a woman and her children who die in childbirth, during childbirth. I found a couple of sets of twins that were born and died on the same day. I think I found 3 men who were crushed between railroad cars. Life expectancy was very short back then, ranged from about 28 years to 44 years old. But not a lot of information other than just names and dates for the the operating of Kendal. I could find, or I have not found yet, any information on the 1850s. By the 1860s, the cemetery was already falling into disrepair. We're talking 12 years after the cemetery closed, and it's already falling apart. I've found an article in the repository from 1862. I'm going to read a little bit of this to you. This is from June 14th, 1862. So already by 1862, in the primitive days of the west side of the county, the burying ground of Kendal was the only cemetery to bury Tuscarawas, Jackson, and Lawrence townships, which I did not know. Many of those whose ancestry in there have erected costly monuments which should be preserved or at least protected from the vandal hands which are destroying them. It has run to waste. The monuments erected by the survivors of the departed dead have been defaced, no one having charge of the ground. Briars and thorns have grown up spontaneously, and in short, of course within the supervision and under control of the town council. Without the town council, the cemetery will fall into complete ruin. If the town authorities desire to preserve the reputation that Massillon enjoys for having beautiful cemeteries, it should at once clean away the rubbish that is now so offensive to Kendal Cemetery, build a good fence and provide for its protection by suitable ordinance. The Friends Cemetery, better known as the Quaker Burying Ground, has been undergoing extensive repairs and will soon be a pleasant place to visit. St. Mary's Catholic Graveyard is filled up in excellent taste and speaks well for our friends. The Massillon Cemetery is as lovely a spot as can be found anywhere, while the old cemetery is a disgrace. So already by 1862, the Kendal Cemetery had become that bad of shape. In 1868, having that big open space and no one taking care of the cemetery, no one tending to the cemetery any longer, squatters started building homes on the periphery of the cemetery. And I'm pretty sure that my mom's house, our house, is one of those houses that were a squatter's home. It was built in 1868. And I think that I had maybe even identified our house on the large map that hangs out in the hallway here. Cemetery stones and a lot of the monuments were used for sidewalks and building materials for the houses that were built on the cemetery. Now in 1868, Arvine Wales he planted and added to the city of Massillon the Union Edition of Massillon. This is the old cemetery. This gives you a better idea of how the Union Edition butted up against the Kendal Cemetery. And I'm just guessing, I don't know this for a fact, but this was called the Union Edition, and I'm guessing that that's probably why and when the cemetery started to be known as the Union Cemetery. Again, that's just a guess on my part. By the early 1870s, the streets of the Wales Addition that ran to the cemetery had become blocked, and access to the cemetery was no longer available because at the ends of those streets, the people that built structures there had put up barns, privies, pigsties, fences, corrals, barns, and so you could no longer get to the cemetery. Now, Robert Folger, who sold cemetery property up at least until 1843, I have an advertisement for him selling plots. He rounded up a group of residents and petitioned City Hall to pass a resolution to erect a tight board fence to protect the cemetery for all time, with the marshal of the city being in charge. City Council did adopt that resolution and a fence was built. This was in 1870. I found an article in 1872, actually just a little snippet, where boards were being stolen from the fence. So much for the fence protecting the cemetery for all time. By the 1880s, the fence was gone. Elizabeth Street, which is our current Andrew Street, was cut through the northern half of the cemetery for access from the village of Kendal to the city of Massillon. And the land, one of the reasons that was cut through, one of the reasons that Elizabeth Street was cut through, was to open up the land to residential and market properties. Now, I haven't been able to find out much about Kendal Cemetery in the 1890s. I found one reference that said that the cemetery land was being used for the grazing of cattle. Other than that, I have not been successful in finding out anything for the 1890s. So the land pretty much lay in ruin. In 1908, a councilman, one of the city councilmen named Mr. Brownwell, asked the council to consider that the cemetery land be considered as a park. And council declined the resolution to make it a park. They did direct that the park be cleaned up. That was done, but again, it was not turned into a park. 1923, we're going to jump forward to 1923. We got this land sitting vacant. It's been sitting vacant since the 1870s. Massillon's growing, and we're looking for land to build residences. City Council decided to take that land, call it the Cypress Street subdivision, parcel it off, and sell the parcels for homes. This was in 1923. So in order to do that, a sanitary sewer needed to be cut through, right down through the center of the cemetery. So, and again, I'm going to read an article here. I mentioned Mrs. Tipping earlier. This is Mrs. Tipping talking here. This is from an article in 1935. And as I said, she kept a journal, and she knew everything there was to know about that cemetery and all the happenings in that neighborhood. She lived next to that cemetery for 60 years. She said, while laying the sewer 11 years ago along 9th Street Northeast to Andrew Avenue, skulls, pelvis bones, jaw bones, and casket trimmings were exhumed from 9th Street to Andrew Street in the plot called Kendal Burying Ground. The bones remaining at the curb at 9th and Andrew until work was done, at which time the skulls and bones were thrown back into the ditch, excepting one skull, which an East Side man took with him. In the ditch towards the south, the bones were not exhumed, but a row of graves was in evidence as skull after skull protruded through the ground at the bottom of the ditch. An older resident said most people buried there died of black fever. And that's the first time that I've heard in my research that I've been doing, that I have done. It's the first reference I had come across where the cemetery was known as anything but Kendal burying ground. Later on, I'll be talking about what it's known as today, how it's known as the Black Plague Pits. Another neighbor, Mrs. Geiger, said that many of the stones were removed, hauled to Sippo Park, and used as building material and sidewalks. She says that afterwards I recognized the stones in the park, many of which had grooves cut across the top, originally holding slabs or monuments. The stones are still in the park. Also, she said she can produce a man who says he saw monuments in cellars, and some of them were not rendered illegible by the elements. So people had been stealing stones, using them in construction, and think of all the bodies that are still there. These bodies were unearthed when they cut that sanitary sewer line through and then thrown back in and covered back up. So there's a lot of bodies still in Kendal Cemetery. Now, I'm sure many of you have heard about how when Massillon Cemetery opened, 200 bodies were exhumed from Kendal Cemetery and relocated to Massillon Cemetery. I read an article as recently as 2015 in the Camp Repository, an article about Kendal Cemetery that said 500 bodies were removed to Massillon Cemetery. I don't know where this information comes from. I'm a stickler for citations, and I'd like to know where this information comes from. Bad citations are better than no citations. Okay, 1928. Fortunately, the Cypress Street subdivision didn't happen. 1928, council again considered the site of Kendal Cemetery as a park. And again, nothing happened. The land still was sitting there vacant. 1939, Mrs. Tipping again. 1939, the residents that lived on Cypress Street, now current 9th Street, and who had property lines adjacent to the cemetery, asked City Council to survey the cemetery into residential parcels so that the citizens that owned property there could buy those parcels to straighten their property lines. And some of those residents, of course, were people like my mom, who squatted there back in 1968. Well, Mrs. Tipping got real outraged about this. This is in 1939. And as I said, she lived there for 60 years next to this cemetery. She kept this journal. She was outraged that the city was going to try this again, to try and survey and parcel off these properties. So she fought City Hall, and it was interesting. I followed this through the newspaper from April through July of 1939, her going week after week before City Council arguing her case. You know, why this is sacred land. You shouldn't do this. You can't do this. She rounded up neighbors. She got the Women's Club behind her. And eventually they won, and City Council backed down and decided that this would remain a park for all times. A flagpole was erected, trees were planted, some shrubs were planted, and Mrs. Tipping, up until the time of her death in 1868, she was really old, 1968, Mrs. Tipping would actually raise the flag on patriotic holidays. And I don't know if this is true or not, and this might not even be an accurate memory, but for some reason, I recall Mrs. Tipping telling me that the spot where the flagpole is located is where Robert Folger, Mayhew Folger was buried. That is true?
She told me that very time.
Okay, my mom would know because she saw Mrs. Tipping's journal. So if you're over at the park at the cemetery, check out where the flagpole is, and that may be the burial site of Mayhew Folger. In the 1960s, the city did finally erect something to designate this Kendal burying ground as a park. And I have a photograph here of my dad, 1966, watering the flowers in front of the sign that said Memorial Park. There was one of these on each corner of 9th Street. And the neighbor, Mrs. Tipping, lived way over here, and she had a flower bed that abutted the cemetery on her side of the property. And she tended that flower bed and made that part of the park look nice. On each of the corners was a sign like this with some shrubs and flowers. And even occasionally flowers would be planted in the big urn. So it was, at one time, people drove by and knew that there was something significant here. Sometime in the late 60s, early 70s, these signs disappeared. And if you drive by there today, this is what it looks like. There's no sign, there's just an empty urn. There's nothing to indicate that those grassy areas on each side of the street are anything but some kind of little neglected park. Now, something I'm very interested in. We're a very history-minded city. Mandy just published a new book on Massillon and Kendal. And the museum is undergoing an expansion. And in a city as history-minded as ours, I would really like to see this cemetery recognized and somehow get some signage of some sort there so that people know that this is Kendal Cemetery, that there are still possibly hundreds of bodies buried there. The first residents of Kendal and many residents of Massillon are buried there. And I think it's a shame that it's not recognized and marked. And I talked to Sandy Kay about this, and I don't know how to write grants. I don't know how to raise money to do that kind of thing. But if the library or the museum or Spring Hill or someone would be willing to help me, I would do everything I could to help make this happen. I'm going to be talking here a minute about this property being now known as the Black Plague Pits. And it's such a shame that, again, in a city as history-minded as ours, that we should go down in history being known as the home of the Massillon Tigers and the Black Plague Pits. All right, so Black Fever Cemetery, Black Plague Cemetery, Plague Pits, Black Death Cemetery, Black Plague Subdivision Cemetery. Those are some of the names I've come across to describe Kendal Cemetery today. Very few people can call it Kendal Cemetery. And this book, Chris Woodyard has written a whole series of Haunted Ohio books, and in volume 5, she spends a full 10 pages. There's a full 10 pages in here about the Black Plague Cemetery in Massillon, Ohio. She never once mentions the cemetery by name. She talks about mass graves, graves containing 40 bodies, people being buried alive in these graves. She talks about my mom's house, because my mom's house is haunted. I grew up in it. It sits on a cemetery. I know that to be a fact. Not once does she mention Kendal Cemetery by name, but she really makes a point of talking about the hauntings and the Black Plague and how it ravaged Massillon. And I have got to tell you that I've been researching this stuff for 40 years, and that's not sitting down every day and doing this. It's just over a period of 40 years. Whenever I've had opportunity, I've researched, tried to find information on the Kendal Cemetery. I looked at those records at the cemetery. I have nothing to indicate that there was ever Black Plague in Massillon, that there was ever a cholera epidemic in Massillon. Certainly, people died from cholera in Massillon, but I think somehow we were spared from the big plague epidemics in 1833, 1849. Certainly, people died from cholera in Massillon, but I found no indication in those handwritten cemetery records to indicate that there were mass graves, that there were tons and tons of people who died from cholera. The Massillon Library has on microfilm and in book form, the cemetery records of Stark County. And I think that includes 25,000 records. Is that right? Yeah. It's a lot.
It's a lot.
And I've been through that book a lot of times doing genealogical research of my own. Nothing in that book to indicate waves of cholera deaths. I have not been able to find out anything that would substantiate that this cemetery was a Black Plague Pit, a cholera cemetery. I just have not come across anything that would indicate that. And also the museum has in its collection, Andy, that letter from a gentleman. I have a copy at home and I neglected to bring it. He sent a letter from Massillon to Detroit and he mentions cholera.
think so.
Yeah, I've seen mention of it, but again, not in mass.
But he mentions cholera, but that's all. He just mentions a case or two of cholera that he knows of, but nothing about everyone hunkering down and preparing for the epidemic that's happening. So, unfortunately, what's left of Kendal Cemetery has become real sensationalized. And if you watch television at all, you know, some of the shows that are really quite popular right now are these shows on paranormal phenomenon and ghost hunting. Just preparing for this talk, I typed in on Google Massillon Plague Pits, and right away, bang, 5 sites came up. Paranormal sites came up where they talked about it. And the one thing, again, citations are so important to me. It's one of my pet peeves. In this day of cut and paste on these websites, same thing, website to website to website. Someone cut and pasted, put it on this website cut and pasted and put it onto this one. So no new information, all the same information, but on many, many different paranormal sites. And so it's become very sensationalized. Massillon Plague Pits, Cholera Cemetery. And then, of course, you always got to throw a ghost or two in for good measure. So in 1886, I ran across this article. This is from the Massillon paper, June of 1886. The title is Grim Reader, Did You Ever See a Ghost? I'll read just a little bit of this. A young man whose name in mercy shall remain unknown was walking home at the hour of 11. He glanced under the lamppost at the corner of North and Prospect Streets. There it stood. His heart smote him, and he says he had barely enough energy to creep away. The creature had a nun's headgear, a white skirt from which emanated a pale phosphorescent light. It stood motionless. That was all he knew. A couple going home Monday night were pursued by the phantom, who waved her long, bony arms, and as she stepped, a clanking as of chains fettering her limbs was heard. The couple did not wait for particulars. 3 or 4 such terrible experiences as these are related, and for some nights past, groups of brave men have laid in ambush ready to pounce upon the goblin, which now refuses to be seen. Wednesday night, Prospect Street was thronged with enthusiastic ghost hunters who kept up their courage by occasionally firing their revolvers into the air. That was in 1886. In 2015, in an article in the Kent Repository, they write about the Massillon Cemetery, or the Kendal Cemetery, and they mention a ghostly woman who still roams the streets around the cemetery. The article also talks about, and I believe this is also in Chris Wickyard's book, also talks about one house being so haunted that a priest was called in to do an exorcism. So, again, that's kind of what's happened to Kendal Cemetery over the years. It's become known as the Plague Pits of Massillon, and I just think it would be such a shame for it to remain the Plague Pits of Massillon. I'd really like to see it recognized as the burial ground of the citizens of Kendal and Massillon. But I would, having said that about not wanting it to be seen as a cholera cemetery, I did come across, when I was doing my internet search for Plague Pits of Massillon, this really wonderful 2-minute video done by Dr. Creepy. He's got this great gravelly voice, and he talks about the Massillon Plague Pits. And I'm going to let Sammy K press the button and let you watch this.
I'm tech support today.
Yeah.
Let me see the volume's all the way up.
Officials, not able to keep up with the number of fresh graves needed, decreed that the dead were to be taken outside of the city limits and buried in a mass grave in order to stem the spread of the disease. The corpses were thrown into a large pit. No grave markers were erected. This happened every time there was an outbreak of cholera. In 1852, after claiming countless victims, cholera had spread for the last time in this small city. Fast forward roughly 16 years. Massillon became a growing city and the need for expansion emerged. Houses were being built everywhere. Either residents had forgotten about the mass graves or the records were lost. When workers began laying the roads in the 1860s, just north of the city, they began uncovering hundreds of remains. It is said that it was not uncommon for the roads to be lined with stacks of bones. As the years went by, development continued. There are stories of homeowners finding remains and rotting coffins while digging gardens and making additions to their home. In one case, a little girl's tombstone was found. The only physical evidence of the so-called plague pits is two small lots known as Union Cemetery. But this serves more as a memorial to the lost bodies than a graveyard. Now a quiet subdivision, stories of supernatural occurrences abound, ranging from disembodied voices to full-body apparitions. Could these be the spirits of cholera victims wandering restlessly until their remains are given a proper burial?
Thank you, Sandy Kate. So that's how Kendal Cemetery is remembered today. And I'd like to see that change. Okay, on the table over there, over the years, with the information I've collected, I've done several iterations of a paper on what I have found of Kendal Cemetery. I have those papers over there attached with one of these fine writing utensils. It says Kendal Burying Ground, Massillon's First Cemetery, 1811 to 1848. No stones, only bones. Along.
Evening, yes. Everyone, my name is Sammy Kay. I am the director at Spring Hill Historic Hall. I was about to say here, I am not the director either, that is Sherry. I want to thank you all for coming out to the second of our speaker series. Our speaker this evening is Amanda Sedlak-Hebner, who is our intern, and she's going to be speaking about snake oil salesmen. I have been told to give a disclaimer. There are no pictures of snakes in this PowerPoint except for a drawing.
There's a drawing.
There's a drawing and an advertisement, sorry.
It's not scary.
But I want to thank you all for coming out. We really do appreciate this. And once Amanda wraps up towards the end, I will just have a few more announcements because we have some literature over there, and the library has pulled out a few of their medicine and health books from the history of medicine and health. So I highly suggest checking those out. We also just want to thank the Massillon Public Library for letting us be here. We don't have this kind of space at Spring Hill, so they have been our home away from home for these presentations. Without further ado, I will turn things over to Amanda.
Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
You can always tell her to speak up.
Okay, I'll do my best. If not, you can always move forward. It looks like we have space here. Welcome to Snake Oil Salesmen, Medicine Shows, and Medications. Notice medications is in quotation marks because we're not really talking about real medications. We're talking about some interesting ones here. See, there's a snake. It's not scary. That's the only one. Many people have heard the word snake oil salesman. Usually, these days, it's used to refer to anyone shilling phony products that claim to cure diseases, things that cure various ailments, or anything that's supposed to make a person's life better. And while it meant that back in the 1800s, it didn't actually start out that way. The term has its roots in the 19th century with real snake oil, like the one in the picture. This led to medicine shows, ads for medications that supposedly cured multiple diseases, and traveling doctors who claimed to be able to help people. It eventually turned into an industry of its own, and it wound up hurting a lot of legitimately sick people in the days before modern medical care. All right, the snake's gone. We're good. We'll start with the origins of snake oil. In the 1800s, thousands of Chinese workers arrived in the U.S. to work on the railroad. Between the years of 1849 and 1880, around 180,000 of these people were immigrated to the western U.S. where they worked on the railroads. They were essentially poorly paid laborers. And the one thing they brought with them was snake oil, which back then was made from real snakes. It actually was made from the Chinese water snake. And that snake was rich in omega-3 acids, which is actually something we hear today. That helped to reduce inflammation. It was useful for people who had arthritis, various aches and pains, and basically any painful ailment caused by digging railroad tracks all day. And they would rub the oil on their knees, elbows, and shoulders. And the best thing about it is the Chinese workers didn't just keep the oils for themselves, they shared it with their fellow workers, which is how word spread about it. The problem was, the oil was in limited supply, because obviously there's no Chinese water snakes here in the US. Getting more from China was a lengthy process, so as word spread and people in pain wanted the oil, not just the railroad workers, anybody who was in pain heard about this and wanted it, the swindlers took over and decided to create their own snake oil from rattlesnakes, which didn't work the same way at all. The people who sold these phony oils became snake oil salesmen. And they eventually went on to claim that the oils would cure more than just aches and pains. They also said these things would cure things like deafness, which obviously didn't work. These medications later became known as patent medicines because they were commercially made and sold over the counter. And that term itself actually comes from England, where it existed since the 17th century. But we're not going to go into all that background just yet. Come on, work. Thank you. Okay, we're on to the traveling snake oil salesman. We're going to start off with the rattlesnake king. His name was Clerk Stanley. He was pretty much the first well-known snake oil salesman. He claimed that he trained with a Hopi medicine man, and his show actually involved him, you're going to like this over there, ladies, dismembering a live rattlesnake on stage. He did this at the 1893 World's Exposition, where he actually took the snake and he sliced it in half, right there in front of everybody. Nice. But the problem is, rattlesnake oil wasn't as effective as the Chinese snake oil because it didn't contain the same substance. They did a scientific survey on it and found out that Chinese snake oil contained almost triple the amount of acid as the rattlesnake oil, so it didn't work at all. And, this is the fun part, Stanley's snake oil didn't even contain any snake oil. In 1906, the Pure Food and Drug Act was put into motion. It was essentially set to clamp down on the sale of patent medicines, and that's what led to Stanley's undoing. They seized one of the shipments in 1917, and federal investigators found out that it contained mineral oil, beef fat, red pepper, and turpentine. Yeah, turpentine. It didn't have any snake oil in it. For this, he was fined $20 whole, which is about $550 today. But it wasn't enough to stop him. He still kept going. And the others, the so-called healers, who were doing their own marketing efforts and picking up where he left off, and they were inspired by him, they kept on selling medications that they claimed took care of a number of different medical problems. Over time, these people became known as snake oil salesmen, which is where the term comes from. After a time, none of their stuff even contained snake oil, and it's not pretending it did. They would just give it different names and have different things in it. Which leads us to medicine shows, which actually were shows. They had sideshows, they had displays of horse riding prowess and stunts, and they had medicine men who used the whole thing as an ad for their magical healing potions. Essentially, the medicine show was a small traveling circus. It had vaudeville-style entertainment, muscle man acts, magic tricks, Native American and Wild West themes. These shows had their origins in performances dating back to the 14th century in Europe, when they had circuses and theaters were banned in that time, and the performances only had the patrons for support. So they'd go around and they'd do their little shows and people give them money and buy tickets, and that's how they made money. But by the late 19th century, medicine shows flourished in the U.S., especially in the Midwest and in the rural South. The medicine man, he called himself a professor or a doctor, even though he was neither. He was a showman and a storyteller. That was his main job, and that's how he sold his medications. The medicine shows were structured around entertainers who would draw in a crowd of customers, and then they would buy their miracle elixirs. Between the different acts, the salesman would lecture the crowd about his medications, and he'd make all these grand claims about all the different things that would cure, even though it didn't cure really any of them. He'd throw in some anecdotes about people who were cured, and he'd actually ask the audience to join in sometimes. This is where plants came from, because they would have plants in the audience who walk up to him and limp, and he'd give them a swig of his medication, and, you know, all of a sudden the guy be jumping around, he was cured, he was fixed. And then everybody else would be like, I want some of that too! So they'd run out and he'd sell out of his medication, even though it was mostly alcohol. Sometimes they'd also use muscle man acts, where a strong man would come in and he'd show off how strong he is. He'd lift things like big rocks or boxes full of stuff. And at first he'd do the little fake thing, like, oh, this is too heavy, I can't lift it. And then he'd take some of the medication and the next thing you know, he can lift it, voila, he's fixed and secure. That's basically what they would do to sell their things. Even though some of the people, no doubt, didn't really believe that these medications did that, they would go ahead and buy them anyway, because you never know. Anything's possible. Thankfully, medicine shows themselves fell out of popularity in the 1920s and 30s, because people not only wised up about the medication claims, but also this was the rise of radio and then eventually TV, and they found other ways to entertain themselves. There we go. And now we're on to 2 local snake oil salesmen. I found ads for these in Ohio newspapers from the 1800s. We have my favorite, Dr. France. Let's see if this thing works here. There's Dr. France. I don't know if you can see that. You notice they kind of look alike, which weirded me out. At first I thought they might have been the same person, and they might actually still be the same person, just going by 2 different names. But anyway, Dr. France, trained in France. Ironic. The ad is from the November 29, 1895 edition of the Defiance Evening News. The other ad here is for Dr. B.E. Ottoman, a celebrated specialist, as he called himself, who had an office in Columbus. His ad was from the Massillon Independent, the March 5th, 1896 edition. Both doctors claimed to have offices in Columbus, which supposedly gave them an air of authenticity. Basically, I'm a real doctor. I'm from Columbus. Come see me. I did a little research on the address and the names, and I couldn't find anything on these 2 other than newspaper ads, which leads me to think that they weren't actually real doctors at all, and maybe they didn't even have offices in Columbus. Who knows where they lived? Both men placed ads for their services, and they travel around the Midwest, and they see patients, and they hand out their cures. I found some stats on Dr. France, who claimed he helped 1,200 people in Ohio, another 1,100 in Indiana, about 500 in Michigan, and this is all in placed advertisement in the newspaper. It wasn't an article on how great he was, it was an ad. But people would read this and they think, oh, you know, this guy has to be legit.
It's in the newspaper.
It's in the newspaper. We're going to go see him. Fake news.
It's like today, it's on the internet.
It must be true. The only problem with these traveling physicians is they'd stop by for a certain period of time, and then they'd vanish. Good luck getting a hold of them. I mean, like I said, they even look alike, so maybe this guy went by 2 different names. And from what I understand, people would believe these people over real doctors. Rather than go to an actual trained physician in their town, they'd go to one of these guys. And if they had a real medical problem, by the time they actually went to the real doctor in their town, it might have been too late for them to even be helped. Because they were believing these guys and whatever they were giving them. That was pretty dangerous. If you look closely at the ads, each one had a certain period of time he was in for. Dr. France was going to be in Defiance at the Crosby House from 8 a.m. to 7 p.m. on December 18, 1895. 2 days later, in that same ad, it says he's going to be at the Burnett House in Toledo from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. If you want to make things easier for him, you could send him a letter to 747 Franklin Avenue in Columbus, where he at least had a mailbox, and explain your symptoms in the hopes that when you got there, he'd already know about your case. But the trick here, if you look at the address of his supposed offices, they're at a different street address in Columbus. He listed that address as 38 and 40 West Gate Street. although it's possible he didn't have any real offices at all, and maybe 747 Franklin Avenue was his house. The other doctor, Dr. Ottoman, was going to be at the Hotel Conrad in Massillon on March 11, 1896. He claimed that there wasn't a fee to begin his treatment, which is hard to believe, but he probably sold enough of his magic healing potions to make up for that. Or he would bill people later. There's really no way of knowing. In the ad, he claimed to cure diseases and deformities, ranging from problems with the eyes, ears, nose, throat, and lungs, to issues with the kidneys, the liver, the bladder. He also claimed he could cure diabetes, my favorite, chronic female diseases, and he can help sexual diseases. That's a lot of specialties. What are the odds he had one thing to fix everything? However, by the 1890s, there were still early hospitals. They were in larger cities, and people also believed in germ theory, which meant that there were actual legitimate doctors out there who knew about these things. But still, people preferred to go see men like this rather than an actual doctor in their town. Maybe these people were cheaper, or maybe they just believed what they were selling. Anything's possible. Basically, these guys went from city to city, and they made a quick buck by hawking potions. And then before people realized that their cures were mostly alcohol, these guys would vanish from sight. Right, that worked. And speaking of alcohol, we're going to go on to the medications and their ingredients. The main one of which was alcohol. Basically, they would sell you booze in a bottle and call it medication, which worked to actually make you feel better for a short period of time, but once it wore off, you still had whatever ailment you had. Some of these medications also had opium, which we'll get to later. That was a big cure back then. And some of them even had cocaine in them. As it turns out, some of these medications had a small amount of herbs that might actually have been beneficial, but because it was so small and washed out by the alcohol in the bottle, it didn't really do anything. What was to make the patients feel better for a short amount of time, which made them think that they'd been temporarily cured by the potion. Some of them even got addicted to the medications, which worked out in favor of the snake oil salesman because these people keep coming back for more of their medications. The more they bought, the more money these people would make. One of the ones here, let's see, this one, Dr. Kennedy's favorite remedy, over here on your left, claimed to cure kidney, liver, and bladder troubles. It was sold in 50-cent and dollar-sized bottles, and if you wrote in for a sample, you could get one free bottle for free. What are the odds that it actually contained alcohol? Pretty good. The other one here, Dr. Radway's sarsaparilla resolvent claimed to cure, and this is my favorite list here, it cured mouth tumors, sore eyes, syphilis, fever sores, something called scald head, night sweats, tremors, and the best one of all, loss of sperm. This one medication cured all of that, despite the fact that it was simply sulfur and molasses in a little bit of seasonings. There were other similar ones like this, called blood purifiers, like Dr. Ayer's sarsaparilla, which included Stillingia, yellow dock, mayapple, a lot of sugar, iodide potassium, and iodide iron. This particular medication claimed that it could cure everything from scrofula, which was a swelling of the glands, to dyspepsia, gout, rheumatism, general debilities, liver complaints, dropsy, something called gravel, female complaints, syphilis, and venereal coughs. It's an awful lot of things that cured in one little swig. There were also non-liquid cures, like tablets, which are similar to what we have today. Only these ones were made out of things like mercury and lead. One of them, called Hollister's Golden Nugget tablets, actually contained a little bit of vitamins and some calcium, but it mostly had mercury and lead in it. Which probably didn't make anybody feel good at all. A few decades after this, radium was a popular cure, although I'm not really going into that because this was about the 1920s. But eventually, these kind of medications led to radium cures where people would drink water that was radioactive in the claims that it would heal them and give them energy. That's where we wound up with that. But there were some patent medicines that helped people. Not everything was phony. Most of it was, but some haven't. Have you heard of anisine or Bayer aspirin? Those are patent medicines that got their start around this time. So is Geritol. So those stuck around and actually helped people, so they were still marketed today. Other ones, Coca-Cola and 7-Up, those got their starts as patent medicines. Even though back then Coca-Cola actually had cocaine in it, but as time went by, they changed the ingredients and started marketing them as soft drinks instead of as medications. Although, I don't know about you, but my daily caffeine dose is kind of a medication. This one is Dr. Pierce's favorite prescription. There's an interesting story behind this one. We're going to start off with Dr. R.V. Pierce, who lived from 1840 to 1910. He attended the Eclectic Medical College in Cincinnati, Ohio. That was actually the name of it, the Eclectic Medical College. After he graduated, he moved to Buffalo, New York, where he started his own medical company, and you see an ad for it right there. His prescriptions were sent all over the company via the mail. And in 1910, he boasted that he sold a whole 2 million bottles per year in the mail. His favorite prescription caused a scandal when Ladies' Home Journal had a lab test a bottle of his medication to see what it really contained. Despite advertising that stated otherwise, the prescription had both opium and alcohol in it, along with various herbs. Now here's the tricky part. Dr. Pierce sued the magazine and he won, because he changed the ingredients in it before the case went to court. So when the court tested it for their official purposes, it actually contained what he said it had. So he got away with it. None of the labs could come up with the same thing that Ladies' Home Journal lab did. Rather sneaky of him. All of his medications were aimed at women. They claimed to be able to cure the enfeebled nervous system. They also helped with various lady problems and menstrual functions. Basically, he found a target market and decided just to run with it. And his target market was women. And these are his exact words. His medications work to tranquilize the nerves, tone up the organs, and increase their vigor and strengthen the system. According to one ad, you see, this is one of the ads that he would have, but there were other ones where it would be this long testimonial in the newspaper. And these things would take up a whole column, and it'd have this long story about how this medication could fix people. And I'm going to read one to you. This one is from the Nebraska State Journal. To be the mother of many children is ranked among nature's chief blessings. But when the cares of the busy housewife are added to the trials of frequent motherhood, it is too great a burden for a woman who is not in prime health and condition. Every woman who is called upon to bear the ordeal of bringing many children into the world needs the support and reinforcement of that wonderful strength-promoting favorite prescription, originated by Dr. R.V. Pierce, Chief Consulting Physician of the Invalids Hotel and Surgical Institute, which he started in Buffalo, New York. And he claimed to be one of the most eminent of living specialists. Mrs. David H. Langley of Lansing, Morgan County, Tennessee, in a recent letter to Dr. Pierce, writes, I am now 36 years old and have given birth to 10 children. Remember, this is the 1890s. 8 only are living. I have twin boys 6 years old. The same spring after they were born, I was confined to my bed all spring and summer with female complaint. Had it so badly I could hardly walk around the house without feeling worse. I was restless at night. Sleep almost left me, and I was almost a skeleton. I did not call my doctor, as I had tried the doctors twice before when I was down with the same trouble, and my husband paid out a great deal for me. I received no lasting benefit. I had almost lost all hope of being able to do anything. My husband had to work very hard, and I could not even attend to the babies. No one can know the distress of my mind as well as body. Dr. Pierce's favorite prescription, which, as a side, contained opium and alcohol, was the only medicine that seemed to do me any good. After I had taken the first bottle and part of the second, I could sleep well, and all my troubles began to get better. I believe I took 8 bottles, and then I felt like a different person. She goes on to write, I gave birth to another baby, and my old complaint came back. I began using the favorite prescription, and was soon relieved and was able to do my work, including the washing. All because she was high on opium. Which brings us to another medication of choice in the 1800s. Laudanum. Who's heard of it? Anybody? Yeah. This was basically the 19th century drug of choice, even though it had been around since the 1600s. It was an alcoholic tincture of opium, which is basically a liquid extract made of herbs. And doctors prescribed it, I'm going to use doctors in quotation marks here, for everything from soothing a cranky infant, yes, they gave it to babies, to treating headaches, and it would help with persistent cough, gout, rheumatism, diarrhea, melancholy, and women's troubles. Here we are again. But laudanum was highly addictive, and numerous people at the time had problems with it. Some very famous laudanum addicts include Lord Byron, Percy Bysshe Shelley, John Keats, Charles Dickens, that one actually surprised me, Edgar Allan Poe, that wasn't a surprise, William Taylor Coleridge, and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Most formulations of laudanum contain 10% opium and 90% alcohol, and they usually flavored it with cinnamon. Not only was it available over the counter, it was recommended by doctors for everything from menstrual cramps to tuberculosis. This made it cheaper than any other form of painkiller, and it made it attractive to those in the lower economic classes. And eventually, people will get addicted to it. By no means was it only used by the poor, though. Wealthy women used it to achieve a pallid complexion, and like I said, even infants were fed a spoonful of it if they were acting up or it seemed like they were hurt or sick or anything. Later on, people eventually realized it was habit forming, and they kept asking for larger and larger doses of it. As time went by, laudanum fell out of favor, and by the 1950s, they had synthesized opioids, and that caused a whole other problem that we're dealing with today. But, did you know they still sell laudanum? You can get a prescription for it. It's used for chronic diarrhea. So if you have that problem, you can go to your doctor and ask for it. You might even prescribe it to you. It's still around, just not over the counter anymore. The main reason why these snake oils, potions, and medications spread so far and wide was because of marketing. Before the invention of television and radio, these potions were marketed through newspaper and magazine ads. And of course through word of mouth and medicine shows and traveling doctors. So word spread and people started to order these things and buy them. Newspaper ads were the most popular outside of the medicine shows. Some medications were sold by mail order. And people could send in a small coupon or write their name on a piece of paper, and then include the amount of cash for what they wanted, and then their magical cure-all potion would arrive in the mail a couple days later. Some of the newspaper ads were lengthy, like the one I just read you about Dr. Pierce's favorite prescription, and they had detailed descriptions of everything that a medication claimed to cure. Other ones had fake testimonials, like the one that I just read. And they had a lot of personal details. It's like they were plants, but not an actual person. It was a written plant. Instead of someone jumping up for the audience, it was the testimonial in the newspaper. Other ads were simpler. There's one here for liver pills. This one right here says they are liver pills. That one reads, Ayer's pills are liver pills, which we already covered. They act directly on the liver, and they make more bile secreted. This is why they cure constipation, biliousness, dyspepsia, and sick headache. Ask your doctor if he knows about a laxative pill.